Verse 25 of Matthew chapter 11. At that time Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this was your good pleasure. All things, he says in verse 27, have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. And then we have an imperative. This is a command. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. So it's an invitation to come, actually a command to come. And then there's an action that we're to be engaged in, to enter into life. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It is a yoke. It is a burden of sorts that we're asked to bear and submit to. But the promise is, number one, Christ will not harm us, for he's gentle and humble in heart. The second promise is we'll find rest. We'll find what we've always looked for. And we'll be able to leave behind those things that have tormented us, where we've been wounded, perhaps sinned against, whatever it might be. This is an invitation to life. Willard would say that this is an invitation to the impartation of life. So from Willard's perspective, as we'll see over the next 2 weeks, salvation is much more than the forgiveness of sin, though it surely entails the forgiveness of sin. Salvation, redemption, regeneration, all these great words of the cross and the resurrection, at its core is the impartation of life to us as embodied selves. Now write that phrase out for me. As embodied selves. Because Willard's thesis is this, is that the human body itself, next 2 weeks are going to be on the human body's relationship to spiritual formation, that the human body itself, your body and my body, can actually become a vehicle that God uses to impart life to us. So God's not simply dealing with our souls. You ever hear that expression? We're going to, probably out of the revival movement in the 19th century, we're going to save souls tonight. Now, what we're going to save are embodied selves who have a soul, but they also have a body. And what Willard is insistent upon is that it's as we use our body in a particular way, in a particular fashion, we're more deeply formed and shaped into the image of Christ. But we have to choose to do so. Discipleship for Willard is a choice. So, for example, if you take a look here, the secret of the easy yoke. Just turn to chapter 1, page 1. He mentions Bonhoeffer. And we've talked some about Bonhoeffer in here. Bonhoeffer, of course, the call to discipleship is the call to change. And Bonhoeffer wrote a well-known work called The Cost of Discipleship. And there is a cost involved in discipleship. There have to always be certain yeses and certain no's when it comes to discipleship. Willard's point, however, is that there's an equally high cost when it comes to non-discipleship. It's not like there's some kind of neutral ground that we can occupy as though, well, I won't be a disciple, but I won't not be a disciple. As though there's some neutral ground. It's one or the other. And whatever the choice is, yes, I will be a disciple, a learner, or no, I won't be a disciple or a learner. Those are the only two I can see that we've got. There's no middle territory there. And some people will back away from this call to discipleship because they'll think, it's going to cost me too much. It'll be too much to give up. It's going to be too hard. I'd rather stay where I am. Now listen to Willard here. He said, the second paragraph on page 1, we would do far better to lay a clear, constant emphasis upon the cost of non-discipleship as well. The cost of discipleship, though it may take all we have, is small when compared to the lot of those who don't accept Christ's invitation to be part of his company in the way of life. All right, so that's the first principle for today. It costs you just as much not to follow as to follow. In fact, Willard argues that it costs more. And the goal is this. The goal is simply to be able to live as he lived. That's the goal. The goal is to be able to live as he lived with that kind of power and love and wisdom manifest in a human being's life. I know it sounds outrageous to say that the first time. To live as Jesus Christ lived. And perhaps even to do some of the things that Jesus Christ did. But that's Willard's belief. He believes that we are created to live like Christ. Now here's the point. We cannot live as Christ lived, manifesting that kind of love and power unless we adopt his form of life. Because he himself, though God incarnate, he was not a divine computer. In fact, the writer of the epistle to the Hebrews says that Jesus learned to obey. So the goal would be, the goal is to become like Christ, and we become like Christ by practicing. This is key now. This is kind of the next 2 weeks. We become like Christ in terms of the ability to love and respond spontaneously to whatever God and God's providence brings into our lives. We become like Christ by practicing the very same disciplines he practiced. Disciplines such as prayer, silence, solitude, meditation, service, worship, celebration, simplicity. The very same means that he, as an embodied self, used, we're called to use. Now see, that's why it's so key to immerse ourselves in Christ's life. To watch what he does so he's prepared to act almost, it seems, instantaneously as his Father is calling him to act in a given situation. Let me show you. Turn over to Luke, chapter 5. Now this is a perfect example how the gospel writers will sprinkle into these texts clues in terms of how Jesus himself conducted his spiritual life. You might write that down. How did Christ himself conduct his own spiritual life? How did he go about it? What did he do? Look at Luke here. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." So look what he does in verse 13. He knows what to do. He knows not only does the man need to be healed, but if all his life, think of how quickly Christ thought this out. If all his life he'd been hearing people scream at him, "Unclean, unclean," and he's having to call out to warn people, "Unclean, unclean," what does Christ do? Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. He knew what to do. He touches the man, and by touching him, he himself becomes ritually unclean. But it doesn't bother him. And then power goes out from Jesus. Power. And immediately the leprosy left him. So we have power going out, and secondly, Jesus knows what to do when he's suddenly confronted with a situation. Are you with me? He knows what to do. Now, Luke's point is, he knows what to do because of verse 15 and 16. Now, Look at the text with me. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. Now look what Luke writes in verse 16. Now this is how Jesus did it. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. See what Luke juxtaposed? Remember that. He juxtaposes Jesus' ministry with Jesus' preparation for that ministry. Jesus, Luke says, often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. That's God incarnate. Now, Willard's question would be this: how much more so do we need to withdraw to lonely places and pray in our much more troubled condition? Why? So that we will have power. So that we will be able to love safely and sanely. If God incarnate, God embodied, found it necessary to often withdraw into solitude and silence and prayer, how much more so we? That's Willard's point. That's one of his main points. Because we are embodied just as Christ was embodied. So let me ask you a question. How often do you withdraw into silence and solitude and prayer? Is it a rhythm in your life? If it's not, I think Jesus would teach this in Willard, if it's not a rhythm in your life, things won't make sense spiritually. Just as simple as that. If it's not a rhythm in your life, you probably will have trouble loving other people. If it's not a rhythm in your life, you'll probably have difficulty leading a chaste life. If it's not a rhythm in your life, you'll probably have struggles about spending money wisely. If it's not a rhythm in your life, you'll eat too many donuts. Or you won't eat enough. If it's not a rhythm in your life, we'll probably be afraid when we don't need to be afraid, anxious when we don't need to be anxious, worried when we don't need to be worried, angry when we don't need to be angry, unable to forgive when he asks us to forgive, if we don't follow the patterns he himself followed. It's such a key point. That's why I'm kind of just slowing down here. It's absolutely key. That's why I want to encourage you. If you're just getting started, dive into the Gospels. Just swim in that water. Swim there. To mix metaphors, just breathe the air of that human being's life because it's God incarnate. And ask yourself the question. See how Luke just kind of dropped that into that text? It's the kind of thing we just read, yeah. Let's get to the healing. And he's saying, no, the healing, the power, the insight came from somewhere. It didn't arise out of a vacuum. It came from Christ's own immersion in silence, in solitude, and in prayer. Apart from this, nothing. This is the sine qua non. That's a Latin phrase that means apart from this, nothing. This is the sine qua non of spiritual formation. It's not asking simply what does Jesus do when he does some of the spectacular things he does. It's asking the question, what did he do in order to do that? See the difference? What did he do in order to do that?